A destitute orphan's quiet kindness makes a billionaire's mute son speak, unaware the desperate man's offer of adoption would lead to a love that would save them all. Make my son talk, and I'll adopt you. The rain hammered down on the grimy pavement like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild, each drop a tiny, shattering explosion against the cold, unforgiving stone. Alara huddled deeper into the cramped doorway, the threadbare wool of her coat doing little to fend off the biting cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, a deep and weary ache that had become her constant companion. She was a fragile silhouette against the city's harsh, flickering light. He watched her. The wind howled through the urban canyons, a mournful sound that echoed the hollow feeling in her chest, a cavernous emptiness where hope used to reside. She clutched the worn, silver locket around her neck, its surface smooth and cool against her trembling fingers, a sacred relic from a life that felt like a distant, half-remembered dream. The biting cold was a physical manifestation of her fear. She was alone. A small, gray cat, soaked and shivering, appeared from the shadows of an overflowing dumpster, its meow a pathetic, brittle sound that splintered the drone of the downpour. Alara watched it for a long moment, seeing a reflection of her own desperate plight in its haunted green eyes. Her stomach clenched with a familiar pang of hunger, a raw and gnawing emptiness that had been her reality for weeks. She had half a sandwich, wrapped carefully in a napkin in her pocket, the last of the food she'd received from a church charity line that morning. It was meant to be her dinner, her only meal until the sun rose on another day of uncertainty. The cat stared at her, unwavering, its small body trembling uncontrollably. A moment of internal hesitation, a fierce battle between her own survival and the profound empathy that was the core of her being, played out in the quiet depths of her soul. Her own need was immense, a crushing weight, but the sight of this smaller, more helpless creature's suffering was unbearable. With a quiet resolve that defined her, she broke the sandwich in two, placing the larger half on the wet ground. The cat crept forward, sniffing tentatively before devouring the offering with a desperate hunger that made Alara's heart ache. A small, sad smile touched her pale lips. She had so little, yet she had given. It was all she had left to give. He saw it all. He saw the worn coat, the trembling hands, the selfless act. He saw the purity of a soul untouched by the world's cruelty, a quiet dignity that shone brighter than any street lamp. He didn't know it yet, but this simple, profound moment of kindness would change everything. The rain continued its relentless assault. She was still hungry. She was still cold. But for a fleeting moment, she felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a gentle glow that had nothing to do with shelter or food. It was the warmth of her own unwavering humanity. She had chosen compassion. Total silence settled in her small corner of the world, broken only by the sound of the rain and the soft crunching of the cat eating her dinner. She pulled her knees to her chest, the locket a cold coin against her skin, and closed her eyes, praying for a dawn that promised something more than just survival. Her breath misted in the frigid air, a visible sigh of a life hanging on by a thread. The city's indifferent lights shimmered through her wet eyelashes, blurring into a kaleidoscope of lonely colors. She was just one of countless forgotten souls, a ghost in the machine of a metropolis that never slept. But she had been seen. The park was a skeleton of its summer self, its trees stark and black against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, their bare branches reaching like desperate fingers towards the heavens. Alistair sat on a cold, wet bench, the picture of tailored desolation, his impeccable cashmere coat soaked through, his polished leather shoes stained with mud, none of which he seemed to notice. Beside him, his son, Leo, sat perfectly still, a small porcelain doll of a boy with haunted, vacant eyes that saw nothing of the world around him. An invisible wall of sterile silence surrounded the boy, a fortress of grief that no one had been able to breach for 2 excruciating years. Alistair's own heart was a shattered ruin, a place where joy had once lived and was now only populated by the ghosts of unspoken words and the relentless echo of a car crash. He was a king of a vast empire of wealth and power, yet he was utterly powerless to mend the 2 broken hearts that mattered most: his son's and his own. The world saw a commanding billionaire. He felt like a beggar. It was then that he saw her again. Alara walked with a slow, weary gait. Her shoulders hunched against a wind that was colder than the one the night before. She carried a thin, threadbare blanket, a wretched thing of faded plaid, but she held it like a treasure. She saw the man and the small boy on the bench, two figures frozen in a tableau of profound sorrow, and her steps faltered. She recognized the look in the man's eyes. It was the same hollow emptiness she saw in her own reflection in shop windows. She saw the boy, so small and so lost, and the protective instinct that was woven into her very soul flared to life. Her mind screamed at her to keep walking, to preserve the one small comfort she possessed against the coming night's deep freeze. The blanket was her only shield, but her heart, that foolish, tender, and unwavering heart, refused to obey. It was a compulsion, a sacred duty to soothe the pain she understood so intimately. She approached them, her footsteps making a soft hush on the damp gravel path. Alistair looked up, his gaze distant, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the girl from the doorway. He just saw another stranger in a world full of them. Alara said nothing. Words were useless against such a seismic grief. Instead, she unfolded the worn blanket, the fabric thin and smelling faintly of rain and wool, and gently draped it over the small, unmoving shoulders of the boy. She tucked it carefully around his small frame, her touch as light as a whisper. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. But Alistair did. He froze. His entire being went still as he watched this selfless act. He finally recognized her. The girl from the alley. The girl with the sandwich. He saw the raw sacrifice, the offering of her only defense against the elements to a complete stranger, to his son. A sob caught in his throat, a raw, unfamiliar sensation. For the first time in 2 years, a crack appeared in the ice that had encased his heart. It was a profound, life-altering impact. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a destitute girl, but an angel of quiet mercy. "Thank you." His voice was a raw, cracked whisper he barely recognized as his own. Alara simply nodded, her own eyes glistening with an unspoken understanding. She gave the boy's shoulder one last, gentle pat. Then she turned to leave, to vanish back into the shadows from whence she came, leaving behind the only warmth she possessed. They had separated again. The night that followed was the longest of Alara's life, a brutal crucible of biting cold and shivering despair. Without the meager protection of her blanket, the city's icy breath was a physical assault, a relentless thief that stole the last vestiges of warmth from her body. She found refuge in the cavernous, echoing halls of a bus station, curled on a hard plastic bench under the sterile, flickering light that offered no comfort, only a harsh, clinical glare. Every gust of wind from the automatic doors was a fresh wave of agony, making her teeth chatter and her thin frame tremble uncontrollably. The hope that had flickered in the park, that momentary connection with the sad man and his silent boy, now seemed like a cruel delusion. Reality was this hard bench, this bone-deep chill, this profound and crushing loneliness. A fever began to creep into her veins, a deceptive warmth that soon gave way to violent shivers. Her thoughts grew foggy, her memories of her parents' faces, usually so clear and comforting, becoming blurred and distant. She was sinking, and there was no one to catch her. Her quiet resolve began to splinter. Meanwhile, across the city, in a stately mansion behind ornate iron gates, Alistair was a man possessed. The image of the girl, her pale face illuminated by the park's dim lamps, her gentle hands tucking a worn blanket around his son, was burned into his mind. That single, selfless act had done what legions of therapists and specialists could not. It had pierced the armor of his grief. It was a sign of purity in a transactional world he had come to despise, a world where everything had a price tag. Her kindness was priceless. It had reawakened his heart, giving him a new, undeniable purpose. The next morning, his usual commanding presence was amplified by a new, almost manic energy. He stormed into the office of his most trusted assistant, a crisp, impeccably dressed man named Arthur. Find her. Alistair's voice was low, but it echoed with an authority that left no room for questions. The girl in the park. I don't care what it takes. Use every resource. I want her found. Arthur, accustomed to his employer's moods, saw something different this time. Not the cold fire of a business deal, but the desperate, raw urgency of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. The search began, a silent, high-tech manhunt for a ghost with no name and no home. Alistair paced the polished marble floors of his study, the city lights twinkling below like a galaxy of indifferent stars. He felt a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt since his wife was alive. This girl, this stranger, had shown more humanity in a single gesture than most people he knew showed in a lifetime. She was out there, alone and vulnerable, and the thought was unbearable. He couldn't wait. He began his own, broader intervention, a wave of anonymous charity aimed at the city's forgotten corners. He poured millions into homeless shelters, funded mobile soup kitchens, and bought thousands of warm blankets to be distributed on the streets. He was trying to repay a debt to a ghost, hoping that somewhere, somehow, the ripples of his actions might reach her, might keep her safe until he could find her. He didn't know that his grand, sweeping gestures were a world away from the single person they were meant for. A girl shivering on a bus station bench, her fever rising, her world shrinking to the simple, desperate need for warmth. The separation was complete, a chasm of wealth and circumstance between them, but a fragile, unspoken thread now connected their two disparate worlds. One was fighting to find a reason to live, the other was just fighting to live. The search was relentless, a quiet army of private investigators combing through shelter records and scanning hours of security footage from the city's unblinking eyes. For 3 days they found nothing. Alara was a phantom, her footprints washed away by the rain. Alistair's frustration grew into a cold dread. He had found a flicker of light in his endless darkness, and now he feared it had been extinguished before he could even reach it. He pushed his team harder, his voice growing more strained with each passing hour. He started visiting the shelters himself, the gleaming, sleek sedan a stark contrast to the desperate streets it navigated. He walked through crowded rooms filled with hollow eyes and weary faces, searching for one particular face, one pair of sincere, gentle eyes. He felt their collective suffering like a physical weight, a stark reminder of the gilded cage he lived in. His wealth had isolated him, cocooned him from this raw human pain. On the 4th day, Arthur's voice came through the phone, steady but urgent. "Sir, we believe we've found her. St. Jude's shelter, downtown. She was brought in last night, very ill." Pneumonia. Alistair's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't wait for details. He was in his car in minutes, the city a blur outside his window. He found her in a small, clean room in the shelter's infirmary, lying on a narrow cot. She was pale, her breathing shallow, her face gaunt. The fever gave her cheeks a deceptive flush of color. Even in sickness, a quiet dignity clung to her. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, a wave of guilt and a fierce, protective anger washing over him. This was the result of her kindness to his son. She had given away her warmth and had nearly paid with her life. The universe's cruelty was staggering. He arranged for the best doctors, turning the small infirmary room into a state-of-the-art medical suite. He sat by her bedside for hours, a silent, unwavering vigil. When she finally woke, her eyes fluttering open, she saw the sad man from the park sitting there, his face etched with a concern so profound it startled her. Disbelief warred with the fever haze in her mind. "You," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "We've been looking for you," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. He offered her a glass of water, his hand steady. When she was stronger, he made his offer. He explained about his son, Leo, about the silence that had taken root in their lives. He offered her a position, a job in his home. "A companion for my son," he said, framing it as a simple arrangement. A warm room, food, a salary. A safe place. Alara was overwhelmed, suspicious. It sounded too good to be true. Kindness like this didn't exist in her world. But then she looked into his eyes and saw not pity, but a desperate, unspoken plea. She saw the same pain she carried in her own heart. She saw a father willing to do anything for his child. And she thought of the silent, hollow-eyed boy on the bench. She agreed. The move to the mansion was a disorienting dream. The cavernous rooms, polished floors, and sterile silence were a world away from the cold streets. It was beautiful, but it felt as haunted as the man who owned it. She was given a beautiful room, clothes made of soft fabrics she'd only ever dreamed of touching. But it was the bond with Leo that slowly began to anchor her. They spent their first days together in a shared, gentle silence. Alara understood that Leo's silence wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken pain. She didn't try to fill it with meaningless chatter or force him to speak. Instead, she sat with him in the grand, sun-drenched library, sharing her own quiet presence. She would read aloud from old, leather-bound books of fairy tales, her voice a soft, steady murmur that seemed to soothe the restless energy that often emanated from the small boy. She brought out sketchpads and charcoal, and they would draw for hours, side by side. Her drawings were of simple things: the stray cat from the alley, a windswept tree in the park, a locket. His were abstract swirls of dark, angry colors, maelstrom of black and gray that slowly, day by day, began to allow small slivers of blue and yellow to peek through. One evening, as a soft hush settled over the stately home, Alara and Alistair found themselves alone in the vast, modern kitchen. The amber hue of the under-cabinet lighting cast long shadows, creating an intimate, quiet space. She was making a simple cup of tea, the familiar ritual a small comfort in this strange new world. Alistair watched her, his usual commanding posture softened by weariness. "He seems calmer with you," Alistair said, his voice barely disturbing the quiet. It wasn't a question. Alara looked down at the steam rising from the mug, her own story bubbling to the surface. "Silence can be a friend," she said softly. "Sometimes it feels safer than words." And then, in that dimly lit, safe space, she began to share. She spoke of her parents, of their laughter and warmth, of the sudden, brutal car accident that had ripped them from her life, leaving her an orphan at 16. She spoke of the locket, the small, sacred treasure that held their tiny portraits, the only tangible piece of them she had left. She spoke of the foster system, the loneliness, the quiet resolve to survive, not with bitterness, but with a profound, unshakable sadness. Alistair listened, his eyes unwavering, his gaze so focused and steady that Alara felt, for the first time in years, completely and utterly seen. He didn't offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of pity. When she finished, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, he simply took the mug of tea from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, and placed it gently on the polished marble counter. He then turned and made her a fresh cup, the simple, empathetic gesture speaking volumes more than words ever could. Then it was his turn. He reciprocated, his voice low and raw with a pain he kept hidden from the world. He told her about his wife, Elena, about her vibrant spirit, her infectious laugh that used to fill every corner of the cavernous house. He described the night of the accident, the pounding rain on the road, the screech of tires, the horrifying silence that followed. Leo had been in the back seat. He had seen everything, and he hadn't spoken a single word since. Their tragedies were different, yet the same. They were two survivors of wreckage, each carrying the ghosts of a devastating loss. A profound, unspoken bond was forged between them in that quiet kitchen, a connection built on the fragile foundations of shared grief. As he finished his story, his voice cracking on his wife's name, Alara reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm, a simple, non-romantic touch that conveyed a universe of understanding. He looked down at her small hand on the crisp fabric of his sleeve. It was in that moment of shared vulnerability and unbearable pain that he made his desperate, heart-wrenching plea. He looked at her, his eyes glistening with a mixture of hope and despair. "Make my son talk," he said, the words a raw whisper. "Heal him. If you can make him speak again, I'll give you anything." I'll give you a home, a family. I'll adopt you." He froze, realizing the weight of his impulsive, emotional words. The days that followed were filled with a fragile, budding hope. Alara's quiet, unwavering patience began to work a subtle magic on Leo. She never pushed, never prodded. She simply existed alongside him, a calm and steady presence in his turbulent inner world. She taught him how to bake cookies, her gentle hands guiding his as they kneaded the dough, leaving streaks of flour on his nose that almost, for a fleeting second, coaxed the shadow of a smile from his lips. They spent hours in the sprawling gardens, where Alara showed him the names of different flowers, her voice a soft melody against the rustling leaves. She would tell him stories about the clouds, imagining them as dragons and ships on a vast blue sea. He would listen, his head tilted, his haunted eyes slowly beginning to show a flicker of light, a spark of interest in the world he had shut out. He began to communicate in his own way, pointing to a picture in a book, or touching her hand and leading her to the window to show her a bird on the lawn. Each small gesture was a seismic victory, a testament to the healing power of her selfless, gentle spirit. Alistair watched from a distance, his heart a painful mix of soaring hope and gnawing fear. He saw the bond forming between them, this fragile girl and his broken son, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. He started to feel things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A warmth spreading through his chest when he heard Alara's soft chuckle echo from the library. A pang of something akin to jealousy when he saw Leo take her hand without hesitation. He was falling in love with the quiet, dignified girl who was saving his son, and the realization shook him to his core. But a storm was gathering on the horizon, personified by Alistair's older sister, Beatrice. She was a woman carved from ice and disdain, a creature of high society who valued pedigree and polished appearances above all else. She arrived at the mansion unannounced, her sleek car gliding up the driveway like a shark. From the moment her cold eyes landed on Alara, dressed in simple but clean clothes, Beatrice saw not a savior, but an opportunistic gutter snipe, a parasite who had somehow latched onto her brother's grief-addled vulnerability. Her contempt was a palpable force, a chilling aura that followed her through the ornate halls. "Alistair, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false concern as she cornered him in his study. "You must see what this looks like. Taking in some stray from the streets? People are talking. It's a disgrace to our family name. She's clearly a grifter, playing on your sympathies." Alistair's defense of Alara was fierce, but it only served to cement Beatrice's resolve. She decided to handle the situation herself, to expose the girl for the fraud she was convinced she was. The perfect opportunity presented itself in the form of the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, a lavish affair hosted at the mansion. It was the pinnacle of the social calendar, attended by the city's elite. Beatrice insisted that Alara attend, framing it as a chance for her to be properly introduced. It was a trap, and Alistair, blinded by his growing feelings and his hope for Leo, walked right into it. The night of the gala, the mansion was transformed. Hundreds of guests in gleaming jewels and designer gowns drifted through the cavernous rooms, their laughter echoing off the polished marble. Alara, in a simple, elegant blue dress Alistair had insisted on buying for her, felt like a ghost at the feast. She was terrified, overwhelmed by the opulence and the cold, assessing stares of the other guests. She kept Leo close by her side, his small hand clutching hers, his silent presence her only anchor in this sea of strangers. Beatrice chose her moment perfectly. During a lull in the music, she stepped onto a small dais, tapping a crystal glass for attention. All eyes turned to her. "My dear friends," she began, her smile as sharp as glass. "I want to thank you all for your generosity tonight, and I also want to address a new addition to our household." She gestured towards Alara, a cruel, theatrical sweep of her arm. The spotlight, as if on cue, swung to find them. Alara gasped, instinctively pulling Leo closer. "This is Alara," Beatrice announced, her voice resonating with manufactured pity. "My brother, in his profound grief, has taken her in." A charity case from the streets, a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beatrice let the humiliation hang in the air before continuing, her voice turning venomous. But I have to wonder about her motives. Seems a rather fortuitous coincidence that a girl with nothing should find herself in the home of one of the city's wealthiest men. In fact, she paused for dramatic effect, pulling a delicate, glittering diamond necklace from her clutch. It seems my late sister-in-law's favorite necklace has gone missing from her jewelry box this very evening. She held it up for all to see, then let her cold gaze fall directly on Alara. Perhaps our little guest was simply looking for a souvenir. The accusation was a physical blow. Alara's face went deathly pale. She was trapped, pinned by hundreds of pairs of judging eyes. She stood dignified, but her entire body was trembling. She was being publicly humiliated, branded a thief. Her worst fears were coming true. She was nothing but trash from the streets, after all. The sterile silence that descended upon the grand ballroom was heavier than any sound, a thick, suffocating blanket of judgment and suspicion. Alara stood frozen in the harsh glare of the spotlight, her hand clutching Leo's, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She could feel the weight of every stare, the sting of every whispered condemnation. Beatrice's smile was triumphant, a cruel slash of red in her pale, powdered face. Alara remained dignified, her chin held high, but inside, her spirit was shattering. The beautiful dress felt like a costume for a fool, the ornate room a cage. She was completely and utterly alone, a fragile ship being dashed against the rocks of this cold, merciless world. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but no words came out. What could she possibly say that they would ever believe? She was a nobody. She was nothing, but she was not alone. That's enough, Beatrice. The voice was quiet, yet it cut through the silence with the commanding force of a thunderclap. Alistair emerged from the shadows at the edge of the room, his movements calm but radiating a power that made the entire room hold its collective breath. He walked towards the dais, his eyes fixed not on his sister, but on Alara, and in his gaze was a raw, protective fury that was terrifying and beautiful to behold. He stopped beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that was both a shield and a declaration. He then turned his unwavering gaze upon the crowd, and then finally upon his sister. "The only thief in this room," he said, his voice low and laced with steel, "is the one who would try to steal a person's dignity." He took the diamond necklace from Beatrice's stunned fingers. "This necklace was not in Elena's jewelry box. I had it taken out this morning to be cleaned. You, Beatrice, put it in your own purse and brought it here tonight specifically to stage this disgusting, theatrical lie." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Beatrice's face, for the first time, lost its composure, her mask of superiority cracking to reveal the ugly, panicked spite beneath. Alistair wasn't finished. His voice rose, filled with a passion that stunned the assembled socialites into silence. "You want to know about this girl? You want to know her motives?" He looked directly at Alara, his eyes softening. "I will tell you. I first saw this young woman in a filthy alleyway, sharing the only piece of food she had with a starving cat. The next time I saw her, she was in a park, giving her only blanket, a threadbare, pathetic thing, to my son, a complete stranger on a freezing cold night. She nearly died of pneumonia because of it." He let the words sink in, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of his guests. "She has more integrity, more compassion, and more honor in her little finger than any of us have in this entire room. She is not a charity case. She is the one who has been saving me." The confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. But the final, most profound salvation came not from Alistair, but from the small, silent figure at Alara's side. Leo, who had been watching the scene with wide, terrified eyes, felt a surge of protective rage for the only person who had ever understood his silence. He saw Alara's trembling form, her glistening eyes, the pain etched on her face. A dam of grief and fear that had been lodged in his throat for 2 long years finally broke. He let go of Alara's hand, took one small step forward, and looked directly at his aunt. A sound, fragile and rusty from disuse, emerged from his lips. "Leave," he said, the single word a monumental effort. Then, louder, clearer, filled with a child's pure, righteous anger, he spoke again. "Leave her." Alone, total silence. The world seemed to stop spinning. Alistair froze, his heart stopping in his chest. Alara gasped, a sob of pure, cathartic shock escaping her. The crowd stared, their mouths agape, witnessing a miracle. Leo had spoken. The boy who had not uttered a sound in 2 years had spoken to defend the girl from the streets. Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. She was speechless, utterly defeated not by her brother's wealth or power, but by the undeniable truth in a small child's first words. The power dynamic had not just been reversed, it had been obliterated. The aftermath of the gala was swift and decisive. Beatrice vanished from the mansion before the last guest had departed, a silent, ignominious retreat into the social exile she so richly deserved. The story of what had happened spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles, a modern-day fable of virtue rewarded and cruelty punished. But inside the stately home, the world had shrunk to the 3 people in the now empty ballroom. The silence that returned was not the sterile, heavy silence of grief, but a new kind of quiet, one filled with awe and unspoken, seismic emotion. Alistair knelt before his son, his hands on Leo's small shoulders, his eyes shimmering with tears he no longer bothered to hide. "Leo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You spoke." Leo looked at his father, and then at Alara, and a small, genuine smile, the first one Alistair had seen in 2 years, graced his lips. "I love her," he said, the 3 words simple, clear, and earth-shatteringly profound. He then ran to Alara and wrapped his small arms around her waist, burying his face in her dress. Alara knelt and held him, her own tears flowing freely, tears of relief, of joy, of a love so pure it was almost painful. She held the small boy who had found his voice for her, and she felt a sense of belonging she thought she had lost forever. Later that night, after a tearful and joyous Leo was finally tucked into bed, chattering away about flowers and cookies until he drifted off to sleep, Alistair found Alara standing on the terrace, looking out at the city lights. The cold night air felt crisp and clean, a world washed new. He stood beside her, the space between them charged with everything that had been revealed. "What you did for him," he began, his voice trailing off, inadequate to express the depth of his gratitude. "What he did for me," she corrected softly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. Alistair turned to face her, his expression tender and raw. "My offer," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "When I said I would adopt you, that was a desperate, foolish thing to say." Alara's heart sank. She thought he was taking it back, that now that Leo was speaking, her purpose here was done. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No," he said, stepping closer, taking her cold hands in his. "You don't. It was foolish because I don't ever want to be your father, Alara. I was a blind man and you taught me how to see. I was living in a tomb and you brought me back to life. You didn't just save my son. You saved me." His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand. "I love you," he said, the words as clear and true as his son's had been. "I think I started falling in love with you that night in the park, when you gave my son the only thing you had. I want to spend the rest of my life repaying that debt, not with money, but with all the warmth and safety and love I have to give." Alara looked up at him, her heart thudding wildly in her chest. She saw not a billionaire, but a man with a kind, wounded heart who had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had. The hollow ache she had carried for so long was suddenly filled with a warm, golden glow. "I love you, too," she whispered, and the words felt like coming home. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss under the vast, star-dusted sky. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, cathartic release. It was the closing of a chapter of unbearable grief and the beginning of a lifetime of security and love. They had found each other in the darkness, 2 shattered souls who, together, had finally become whole. 1 year later, the pounding rain and biting cold were a distant memory, replaced by the golden glow of a perpetual summer afternoon. The stately mansion, once a cavernous mausoleum of grief, was now a home, filled with the sounds that had been absent for so long. Laughter, chatter, and the soft melody of a piano being played with more enthusiasm than skill. The sterile silence had been banished forever, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful noise of a family. In the sprawling gardens, where Alara had first taught Leo the names of the flowers, a new, far more colorful garden was in full bloom. Alistair, his crisp business shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, had a streak of dirt on his cheek as he helped Leo pat down the soil around a newly planted rosebush. Leo, no longer a silent, haunted doll, was a whirlwind of boyish energy, his voice a constant, cheerful stream of questions and observations. "Do you think this one will be red? I hope it's red. Alara loves the red ones the best," he said, looking up at his father, his eyes bright and full of life. Alara watched them from a nearby bench, a sketchbook open on her lap, though she wasn't drawing. She was simply absorbing the perfect, idyllic piece of the moment. A soft, cashmere blanket, a far cry from the threadbare one she'd given away, was draped over her shoulders, a gift from Alistair. Her worn silver locket was still around her neck, but now, nestled beside it, was a simple, elegant diamond ring that shimmered in the afternoon sun. She was no longer a fragile silhouette against a harsh city, but the warm, steady center of this small, happy universe. Alistair caught her eye and smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. He walked over to her, wiping his hands on his trousers, and sat beside her, draping an arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I was just remembering a girl in a doorway," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "She was so cold and hungry. I wish I could go back and tell her that it was all going to be okay, that she was about to meet a very sad man and a very quiet little boy, and that they were going to save each other." He kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with a love so profound it still sometimes took his breath away. "That sad man is grateful to that girl every single day," he whispered. Leo ran over, holding up a freshly picked, bright red rose, its petals still dewy. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Alara with a proud grin. "Because you're our sunshine." Alara took the rose, her eyes glistening. She pulled Leo into a hug, with Alistair wrapping his arms around them both, a complete and perfect circle of love. The sun cast long, gentle shadows across the lawn. The air was filled with the scent of roses and damp earth. They had faced the deepest hardships, the most profound grief, and had found their way through the darkness, guided by the simple, unwavering light of a single, selfless act of kindness. Their happily ever after was not an ending, but a beautiful, sun-drenched beginning. This story is a testament to the profound and often unseen power of a single act of kindness. It reminds us that in a world that can often feel cold and transactional, the purest currency we possess is our compassion. Alara, who had nothing, gave everything she had, not for reward, but from the sincere and gentle impulse of a pure heart. She did not know that her small offering of a blanket would be the key that unlocked two souls from a prison of grief. Alistair and Leo, who had all the material wealth in the world, were impoverished in spirit, trapped in a sterile silence. It was Alara's selfless warmth that reminded them how to feel, how to connect, and ultimately, how to heal. Their journey shows that true wealth is not measured in dollars, but in the love we give and the light we share. It is a fable of how the most fragile among us can possess the most unbreakable strength, and how seeing the humanity in a stranger can be the first step toward saving ourselves. If this story touched your heart and served as a reminder of the quiet miracles that unfold around us every day, please let it inspire you. In a world full of noise, a simple gesture of empathy can echo louder than any shout. The love and healing found by Alara, Alistair, and Leo began with a choice to see another's suffering and to offer comfort without expectation. May their story encourage you to be the source of unexpected warmth in someone else's life, to be the flicker of light in their moment of darkness. True connection is the most valuable treasure we can ever hope to find. We hope this soul-stirring tale has warmed your spirit. For more inspiring stories of love, redemption, and the incredible power of the human heart, please like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue bringing these heartwarming narratives to the world, reminding us all that even in the deepest despair, hope and love can bloom in the most unexpected ways. We'll see you in the next one.